The biting, merciless wind howled across the highest battlements of the Lernazan citadel, carrying with it the bitter chill of the turning season. High above the sprawling capital, the towering stone walls felt less like a protective barrier and more like the sharp edge of the world. Down below, thousands of tiny figures clustered in the Grand Plaza, a vast ocean of Drea's citizens waiting in an uneasy, shivering hush. They were gathered to watch the flames. It was practically impossible for the common folk to approach the citadel itself. The sheer vertical drop and the heavily fortified iron gates ensured that the distance between the rulers and the ruled remained vast, cold, and entirely unbridgeable. A heavy, iron-reinforced wooden cart rumbled across the uneven stone pavement, pushed by 4 thick-shouldered men grunting under the immense effort. The wooden wheels clacked rhythmically, bearing the royal coffin toward the edge. Elite soldiers of the honor guard lined the perimeter, their coal-colored armor absorbing the gray, lifeless daylight. Further back, safely distanced from the ledge, Chief Advisor Ilazar and High Commander Manza watched the procession in solemn silence. At the very edge of the battlements stood a sharp, metallic protrusion, a massive steel balcony jutting out dangerously over the dizzying drop. It was the traditional platform from which the monarchs addressed their subjects, a harsh, uninviting structure that offered no warmth and no connection to the people below. Standing just out of the public's line of sight, shrouded in the shadows of the stone pillars, was Luria. A lone woman, clad in heavy, ash-stained ceremonial robes, stepped up to the cart. She held a thick torch, dripping with black pitch. With a practiced, ritualistic motion, she thrust the fire into the oil-soaked timber beneath the king's body. The wood caught instantly with a violent whoosh. A tremendous pillar of orange and yellow fire roared into the gloomy sky, hungrily consuming the remains of King Nirzal. The intense heat washed over the cold metal platform in suffocating waves, carrying the heavy scent of burning pine and roasted flesh. Luria watched the violent flames lick the sky, her pale face an entirely motionless canvas. Not a single muscle twitched. There was no sorrow in her posture, no final tearful farewell in her gaze. In the rear ranks, Ilazar let out a long, heavy sigh, the sound barely audible over the roaring fire. Beside him, Manza gripped the hilt of his greatsword, his heavily scarred knuckles turning white as he offered his fallen, blood-soaked warlord a silent, final salute. The pyre was still crackling violently, spitting embers into the wind, when Luria decided it was time. She did not pause for a customary moment of silence. She stepped directly out of the shadows, her boots ringing sharply against the metallic grating of the protruding balcony. Instantly, a surge of panic rippled through her personal guard. Exposing the new ruler to the open air and the unseen thousands below was a massive, terrifying security risk. Several heavily armored men lunged forward instinctively, desperate to form a protective shield wall around her. "Careful, matriarch," one of the captains hissed, reaching out to pull her back from the exposed edge. Luria did not even turn her head. She merely raised a single hand, her palm facing the guards. It was a slight, effortless gesture, but it commanded the authority of a collapsing mountain. The soldiers froze mid-step, instantly recognizing the deadly, unspoken boundary she had just drawn. She stepped to the very lip of the cold metal platform and looked down. The moment her silhouette appeared against the backdrop of the billowing gray smoke, the low, anxious murmuring of the massive crowd below was severed instantly. It was as if a blade had cut the throat of the city. A profound, heavy silence settled over the capital. 10 full seconds ticked by. It was a perfect, terrifying quiet, thick with anticipation and the distant crackle of the king's funeral pyre. Then Luria spoke. The unique curved architecture of the citadel walls caught her voice, amplifying the smooth, resonant tones of her words and casting them down over the city like a heavy iron net. "People of Drea," she began, her tone measured, dominant, and entirely devoid of grief. "You have witnessed the final journey of my father, King Nirzal. He fought a long, exhausting battle with an illness. Now he has finally found his peace." She paused, letting the reality of the dead king settle into the cold stones of the plaza below. You have not witnessed the setting of a single sun today, but the rising of hundreds. This is a dawn so fierce that from this moment forward, none of you will ever feel unsafe. None of you will feel abandoned, and none of you will be orphaned. I am building a brand new Drea for you, stronger, more fruitful than anything written in our bloody histories. Through the ceaseless, unyielding reforms I will enact, you will taste the true glory that beats at the heart of our kingdom. You will feel the power deep within your marrow. As your new ruler, as your owner, and as your mother, as Matriarch Luria, I greet you. The echoing syllables faded, leaving a chilling void in their wake. And still, the crowd remained entirely mute. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the vast plaza, thousands of faces turned upward, paralyzed by a potent mixture of shock, deep confusion, and a rapidly blooming dread. King Nirzal had been a brutal, unforgiving man, but he was a known entity. He was a beloved figure in his own violent way, a towering, fearless warrior who led massive armies from the front lines, swung a heavy sword, and spoke the raw, uncomplicated language of warfare. The people understood him. Now, this young woman had stepped out of the smoke, and in less than a minute, completely overshadowed his legend. Her words tasted terribly wrong to them. Nirzal was renowned across the continent for his immense, terrifying physical strength, yet Luria had casually framed him as a man tired by illness, a fading force that needed to be replaced. She had subtly stripped away his terrifying aura, implying a weakness the people had never seen nor believed. And then there was her promise of a brand new Drea. She spoke of ceaseless reforms. To the commoners, the blacksmiths, the laborers, and the thousands of slaves standing in the dirt, reform was a sterile, bureaucratic phantom. It held no weight, no warmth, and no clarity. They lacked details. How could a kingdom built entirely on raw conquest and slavery be reformed? They had looked up to that metal balcony, desperately hoping to see a new warlord, someone with a familiar iron fist who would promise to crush their enemies and protect the walls. Instead, they were handed a calculating, reformist woman who confidently called herself their owner and their mother in the exact same breath. The psychological dissonance was jarring. A collective, invisible shiver rippled through the sea of bodies. They were deeply unnerved. The comforting, bloody predictability of Nirzal's cruelty was gone forever. In its place stood a cold, brilliant enigma. Whispers finally began to break the silence. Anxious, trembling questions exchanged between terrified neighbors. What is going to happen to us? What does this new Drea mean? Will the chains grow tighter or just change their shape? They felt no comfort in her promises. They only felt the terrifying grip of an unpredictable, looming machine preparing to grind them down. High above, Luria stared down at the restless, silent mass of bodies. Her face remained a perfect mask of chilling indifference. She did not study their fearful expressions for long, nor did she attempt to pass their silent panic. Their immediate comprehension was entirely irrelevant to her grand design. Pivoting sharply on her heel, she turned her back on the city and the burning pyre. She walked briskly past the frozen guards, heading straight for the rear ranks, where Ilazar and Manza stood waiting. Ilazar, ever the political survivor, immediately stepped forward to fill the tense air with soothing words. "Your people will be profoundly grateful, matriarch, once they finally taste the glorious future you have prepared for them," the advisor said, his voice smooth and heavily layered with practiced sycophancy. "They might be a little quiet right now, perhaps overwhelmed by the magnitude of the day, but I am entirely certain they understood your vision. Shall we proceed to your coronation ceremony?" Luria did not even break her stride as she walked past him toward the heavy citadel doors. "They will get used to it," she replied, her voice cold, flat, and final. "They will adapt." The transition of supreme power culminated deep within the darkest, most secluded halls of Lernazan. The coronation chamber was deliberately stripped of all the usual pomp, bright banners, and loud celebration. It was a quiet, profoundly solemn affair, lit only by a few flickering wall sconces. Luria stood tall and rigid as the ancient relic of rule was brought forward on a dark velvet cushion. The crown of Drea was a magnificent, daunting piece of craftsmanship. It was forged from a single, seamless block of heavy, pure silver. It did not merely rest upon the hair like a delicate ring. It was a dominant, aggressive piece of facial armor. The intricate silver stretched smoothly over the forehead and descended into a solid, unyielding plate that completely covered the upper half of the face. It was not a mask equipped with eye holes. It was a solid, continuous barricade against the light. As the cold, heavy metal was carefully lowered onto Luria's head, her physical world was instantly plunged into pitch-black darkness. But for the matriarch and for the unique lineage of Drea, this sudden blindness was not a vulnerability. It was a profound, terrifying awakening. The ancestors of Drea had been creatures of the deep, subterranean dark, thriving in environments where light was a distant myth. The moment her vision was severed by the silver plate, an ancient biological switch flipped violently within her. Her true dormant senses flared to life with terrifying clarity. The darkness acted as a sharpening stone, cutting away the chaotic, misleading distractions of sight and elevating her intuition to supernatural levels. The ambient atmosphere of the room exploded into a rich, three-dimensional tapestry of sound, temperature, and vibration. Her pointed ears twitched, highly active, capturing the microscopic rustle of Ilazar's velvet robes rubbing together, the heavy, rhythmic thumping of Manza's heart beneath his thick armor, and the faint, uneven breathing of the guards stationed by the heavy oak doors. She could sense the exact displacement of air as someone shifted their weight across the room. She was blind, yet she now perceived the chamber with a deadly, inescapable accuracy. From behind the cold, solid silver plate, Luria drew a deep breath. She could no longer look upon her subjects, but she could hear every frantic beat of their hearts. She turned her smooth, silver-plated face precisely toward the spot where the advisor lingered. "Gather the ministers," Luria commanded, her voice cutting cleanly through the damp chill of the room. "Tell them to convene in the great hall. We will discuss the impending movement of reform, and we will address the lingering business my father left behind." Ilazar bowed deeply, a movement she registered through the heavy rustling of his expensive velvet robes and the subtle displacement of the stale air. "Do not worry for a single moment, matriarch. They stand at the ready. They are positively eager to hear of your new dawn." The old bureaucrat turned and swiftly exited the chamber. Once he crossed the threshold, the practiced calm on his face shattered completely. Ilazar felt a cold, slick sweat clinging to the back of his neck. He navigated the winding, torch-lit corridors of the citadel with the hurried, desperate stride of a man trying to outrun a collapsing ceiling. He passed beneath towering stone arches and severe statues of ancient warlords until he reached a secluded, open-air courtyard on the mid-level. There, clustered together like a flock of anxious ravens, stood the high ministers of Drea. They were men of immense wealth and influence, adorned in fine silks and heavy jewel-encrusted chains of office. But right now, their faces were pale with raw apprehension. Ilazar approached them quickly, raising a weathered, trembling hand to silence their immediate flurry of questions. "The matriarch expects you in the Great Hall," he said, keeping his voice to a harsh, urgent whisper. He locked his tired eyes with the most prominent lords, making sure his warning pierced their panic. "But I am warning all of you right now. Listen to me very carefully. If the reforms she presents threaten to damage our established system, if they disrupt the flow of our governance, you must prove it to her, cleanly, logically, and respectfully. If you have no concrete proof, keep your mouths shut, or you will suffer immensely. And if she shows even a hint of resistance to your logic, do not push her. Yield immediately. I do not want anyone's carefully built order, neither yours nor mine, ruined today. Do you understand me?" The ministers exchanged terrified, wide-eyed glances. The old king had been a brute, but he had let them run their departments in profitable peace. This new, unseen threat was different. They swallowed their pride and nodded in fearful, desperate unison. Following Ilazar's lead, the group ascended the grand spiral staircase. Their leather shoes echoed hollowly up the narrow stone shaft, a grim march toward the unknown. They entered the Great Hall, a cavernous, intimidating room dominated by a massive dark oak table polished to a mirror shine. Tall, narrow windows let in slices of grey daylight, illuminating the dark, historical tapestries that hung from the high walls. But the imposing chair at the head of the table remained entirely empty. Luria made them wait. Minutes bled into a heavy, agonizing quarter of an hour, then 20 minutes. The ministers shifted awkwardly in their finely carved seats. They whispered nervously to one another, pulling at their tight collars, feeling the crushing, deliberate weight of their own helplessness. It was a flawless psychological tactic. By the time the heavy oak doors finally groaned on their iron hinges, the men were exhausted by their own dread, their nerves entirely frayed. "Attention!" barked an honor guard, stepping through the threshold with a loud metallic crash of his coal-colored armor. "Your supreme matriarch, Luria, approaches." The low hum of anxious chatter evaporated instantly. The ministers scrambled to their feet in a chaotic frenzy, the wooden legs of their chairs scraping harshly against the stone floor. Hands darted out to frantically smooth wrinkled tunics, straighten crooked badges, and wipe sweat from furrowed brows. Then they froze like statues, holding their breath. Luria drifted into the grand room. She wore the blinding crown of solid silver, an intimidating, featureless visor that erased her mortal visage and gave her the aura of a judging, mythical deity. She walked with terrifying precision, her boots clicking in a steady, unhurried rhythm. She did not stumble. She was guided flawlessly by the heightened pulse of the room, the heat radiating from their bodies, the rapid beating of their hearts. She did not turn her silver-plated face toward any of them. She simply glided past the trembling men to the head of the long table and gracefully took her seat in the high-backed chair. One of the guards stepped back out into the corridor, pulling the massive doors shut with a booming, final thud that echoed like a sealing tomb. The second guard remained inside, a silent, heavily armed sentinel standing rigidly by the exit. Luria sat in total, suffocating silence. Beneath the cold silver plate, her highly attuned ears were busy mapping the room. She picked up the frantic, irregular heartbeats of a dozen powerful men. She heard the dry, painful swallowing of parched throats, the slight squeak of leather as someone shifted their weight, the faint trembling of fingers resting against the oak table. She was weighing their fear, measuring their profound discomfort. The ministers were completely lost in this oppressive quiet. They could not read her eyes, could not gauge her mood, and her featureless silver mask offered zero clues. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical weight, pressing down on their chests. Luria was silently, methodically testing them. Finally, when the tension in the air became nearly explosive, Luria leaned forward slightly. "Speak, gentlemen," she said, her voice smooth, but carrying a razor-sharp, chilling edge that commanded the entire hall. "For 3 decades, I have watched you from the shadows. I have quietly studied your movements, and I have taken my notes. Now, I want to hear yours." She let her unseen gaze sweep across the length of the table, though she did not need to see their faces to feel them flinch. "Much is going wrong in Drea," she continued, her tone dropping into a dangerous clinical register. "Our military policies are on the verge of collapse. The common folk are drowning in deep, unnecessary misery. We have garrison commanders acting entirely on their own rogue whims, profound administrative rot eating away at our foundations, and a remarkably pointless, inefficient slave policy." She rested her hands calmly on the polished wood of the table, a stark contrast to the trembling hands of her subjects. "Tell me," Luria demanded gently, "where is Drea failing?" The high ministers of her kingdom sat rigid in their high-backed chairs, paralyzed by the unknown entity that had just inherited their world. The silence stretched, pulling taut like a bowstring about to snap. Finally, there was a subtle shift in the air pressure to her right. The rhythmic wheeze of a heavy-set man's lungs hitched. He was raising his hand. The rustle of his thick velvet sleeve was as loud as a thunderclap to Luria's pointed, highly attuned ears. She did not turn her silver-plated face. She merely raised 2 slender fingers, granting him the floor with a microscopic, dismissive wave. The Minister of Economy swallowed hard. His throat made a dry, clicking sound. When he spoke, his voice trembled, betraying the immense effort it took to break the silence. "Supreme Matriarch," he began, bowing his head even though she could not see him. "Chief Advisor Ilazar had previously shared the entirety of your reform plan with us. I assure you, I have read every single page meticulously before attending this council, my lady. Within the context of our kingdom's economy, you have suggested several modernizations." "I did not suggest." Luria's voice snapped through the hall like a physical whip. It wasn't a shout. It was a cold, razor-sharp hiss that cut his sentence at the knees. The sudden interruption echoed off the dark stone walls, leaving a chilling resonance in its wake. The minister froze. The blood drained from his face, leaving him pale and wide-eyed. He sat frozen for 2 agonizing seconds, his mind scrambling to recover from the lethal misstep. He could feel the eyes of his peers sliding away from him, distancing themselves from a man who might already be a walking corpse. He took a ragged breath and forced himself to lean forward, his hands trembling violently on the polished oak. "Forgive me, my lady," you commanded. "I misspoke." He paused, praying for a sign of clemency from the featureless silver mask. When none came, he pushed onward, driven by the desperate need to prove his competence. There were simply a few intricate details regarding these commands that I found difficult to comprehend. The texts state that every household in Drea, without exception, must pay a yearly silver quota determined solely by the state. It goes on to detail that any citizen who fails to meet this quota will be immediately downgraded in status to a tax debtor, a rank described as only a fraction of a step above outright slavery. Furthermore, it dictates that these debtors will be stripped of their freedom and forced to toil in the deep mines and harvest fields, replacing the current slave labor force, to pay off a debt they can never realistically clear. He trailed off, the horrific magnitude of the policy hanging heavily in the cold air. It was a decree of systemic, calculated ruin. It would intentionally plunge hundreds of thousands of free Drea citizens into indentured servitude. Luria had been waiting for this exact moment. She could feel the rising heat of his indignation beneath his fear. Slowly, deliberately, she leaned forward, pressing her hands flat against the dark wood of the table. She angled her silver-crowned head directly at him, locking onto his frantic heartbeat like a predator, cornering its prey in the dark. "Yes," she said, her tone dripping with dark, mocking patience. "What part of this elegantly simple equation do you fail to understand? We possess a massive stagnant population of foreign slaves occupying our fields. I am moving them. I will displace that entire slave population to our borderlands. I will arm them, starve them, and use them as expendable infantry, as cannon fodder, and as weapons of mass migration against our enemies. They will bleed for Drea's expansion. And the labor camps they leave behind? Those empty fields and silent mines will simply be filled by the tax debtors." The sheer pragmatism of her cruelty was breathtaking. She was turning her kingdom into a massive, grinding machine that fed on its own people to fuel an endless war machine abroad. The Minister of Economy yelped a small, pathetic breath. The logic was unbreakable, but the cultural sacrilege was immense. Driven by a foolish, fleeting spark of patriotic courage, he dared to ask the question, burning in the minds of every lord at the table. "Supreme Matriarch," he stammered, raising his hands in a gesture of supplication, seeking refuge in a plea for mercy. "I ask this only out of deep devotion to your crown. Is this maneuver not simply discarding the foreign filth we conquered, only to punish our own blood, to enslave the proud citizens of Drea? Will this not incite rebellion? Will this not irreparably tarnish your glorious name?" The moment the words left his lips, the temperature in the great hall seemed to plummet to freezing. The other ministers stopped breathing entirely. They pressed their backs hard against their wooden chairs, wishing they could meld into the stone walls. Luria paused. She remained leaned forward for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until it became physical agony. Then, very slowly, she leaned back against the plush velvet of her high seat. She tilted her head slightly, offering a slow, rhythmic nod. "Ah, I understand you now," the gesture seemed to say. It was not a nod of agreement, but a fatal diagnosis. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue policy. Instead, Luria simply turned her featureless face toward the heavy oak doors. She offered a single, fluid flick of her wrist toward the honor guard stationed in the shadows. The soldier moved with terrifying, mechanical efficiency. There was no hesitation, no questioning of the order. The sharp, metallic shing of his heavy broadsword, clearing its dark leather scabbard, shattered the quiet of the hall. He stepped out of the shadows, a towering dark knight of coal-colored steel, his heavy boots shaking the floorboards as he marched directly toward the minister of Economy. "Wait, no, please, my lady," the minister shrieked. His previous bravado evaporated into high-pitched, primal terror. He scrambled backward, his boots slipping on the polished stone as he tried to push his chair away from the table. The guard was too fast. A massive, steel-gauntleted hand shot out, grabbing the minister by the thick, embroidered collar of his tunic. With a sickening display of raw strength, the armored soldier hoisted the heavy-set man entirely off the ground. The minister dangled in the air, his legs kicking wildly, knocking over silver goblets and scattering heavy parchment scrolls across the table. He screamed, a wet, tearing sound of absolute despair, his hands clawing uselessly at the cold steel gripping his neck. The guard did not blink. With a violent upward thrust, he drove the broadsword directly into the minister's side, burying 3 feet of cold steel deep into his abdomen and up through his rib cage. The scream was cut short, replaced by a wet, bubbling gasp. With a brutal twist of the blade, the guard yanked his weapon free and carelessly hurled the dying man forward. The heavy body slammed onto the center of the grand oak table with a bone-shattering crack. The other ministers recoiled in sheer horror, pressing their hands over their mouths to stifle their own cries. A thick, viscous fluid began to rapidly pool around the twitching body. But it was not crimson. From the gaping wound in the minister's side poured the luminescent, striking azure of Drea blood. The bright blue liquid flowed over the dark, polished oak like a glowing, morbid river, dripping steadily off the edge of the table and splashing onto the cold stone floor below. The sharp metallic scent of copper and ozone instantly overpowered the smell of fear in the room. The minister convulsed twice, his eyes rolling back into his head before going completely still. The blue pool continued to widen, slowly creeping toward the trembling hands of the other lords seated around the table. Luria had not flinched. She had not recoiled from the sound of tearing flesh or the heavy thud of the corpse. She sat perfectly still, her highly tuned senses absorbing the sudden spike in terror, the wet dripping of the azure blood, and the chaotic, terrified heartbeats of the survivors. She let them stare at the corpse for a long, agonizing moment. She let the reality of their new existence burn into their minds. When she finally spoke again, her voice was calm, conversational, and utterly devoid of mercy. "Gentlemen," Luria began, her words gliding smoothly over the metallic stench of the room. "The reforms will happen. Whether they settle comfortably into your minds or whether they completely disgust you, they will happen. You have 2 choices. You will either become a functioning part of my new engine." She gestured blindly, but perfectly accurately, toward the center of the table. "Or you will remain here, as a fading memory, lying in a puddle of your own blue blood, and I assure you, you will not be remembered." She leaned forward once more, the silver plate catching the dim light of the braziers, giving her the appearance of a cold, inevitable force of nature. "Your understanding of my methods is irrelevant," she whispered, the soft sound carrying to every terrifying corner of the hall. "Your comprehension is not required. Your approval is meaningless. Drea does not need your permission to evolve. It only needs your obedience. Are there any further questions regarding the economy?" The only answer was the steady, rhythmic drip of azure blood hitting the stone floor. It fell from the edge of the polished oak table in a steady, morbid cadence, measuring the agonizing seconds of silence. The remaining ministers sat absolutely paralyzed in their high-backed chairs, their lungs refusing to draw breath, their eyes locked in sheer, unadulterated terror upon the lifeless, butchered body of the Minister of Economy. From behind the impenetrable, featureless barricade of her solid silver crown, Matriarch Luria absorbed the profound shift in the room's atmosphere. She did not need eyes to witness their devastation. She could smell the sour, metallic stench of their sudden panic, mingling with the ozone-rich scent of the spilled blue blood. She could hear the chaotic, frantic drumming of their hearts, a frantic, irregular rhythm of prey that had just realized the cage was locked. When Luria finally broke the silence, her voice did not rise in anger. It dropped into a soft, deadly purr that slithered across the long table, wrapping around the throats of the surviving lords. "You now know exactly what I am talking about," she murmured, the syllables perfectly articulated, carrying a terrifying, absolute certainty. "I know that you understand me now, gentlemen. There will be no further confusion regarding the text of my decrees." She leaned back slowly into the plush velvet of her chair. The subtle creak of the wood sounded like a cracking whip in the quiet hall. The implementation schedule for these reforms will be finalized shortly. It will be drafted word for word, law by law, and you will execute it, she commanded, her tone hardening into cold, unforgiving steel. You will implement every single mandate, down to the last punctuation mark. Do not think you can hide behind bureaucratic delays or intentional incompetence in the dark corners of your departments. I will have my people watching you. You will be under constant, unyielding surveillance. But here is the beauty of it. You will never know who those watchers are. It might be your most trusted scribe, the servant who pours your wine, or the guard at your chamber door. Luria tilted her silver-plated face, letting the terrifying promise sink deep into their bones. Do not even attempt to stray from the path I have laid out. Drea is a kingdom that offers immense promise, yes, but as you have just witnessed so vividly, it can extinguish hope just as swiftly. Drea can end you in a single breath. Now, all of you, get out of my sight. Withdraw. The spell of paralysis broke, instantly replaced by a frantic, undignified scramble for survival. These were the highest-ranking aristocrats of the Citadel, men who usually moved with practiced grace and suffocating arrogance. Now, they were reduced to the state of panicked insects, fleeing the sudden, crushing descent of a heavy boot. Chairs scraped violently against the stone floor, several tipping over entirely and crashing with loud, wooden clatters. The ministers lunged for their scattered parchment scrolls and leather-bound ledgers, their hands shaking so violently that silver quills rolled off the table and inkwells spilled, staining their frantic fingers black. They moved with clumsy, desperate jerks, their eyes wide and completely unblinking. One elderly minister, in his blind haste to gather his notes, leaned too close to the center of the table. The sleeve of his expensive silk tunic brushed against the widening pool of bright blue blood. He let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper, jerking his arm back as if the azure fluid were boiling acid, leaving behind his crucial documents in his desperate bid to retreat. They did not dare to look back at the silver throne. They did not bow. They simply scrambled toward the heavy oak doors, shoving past one another in a pathetic display of raw cowardice. The honor guard stationed at the exit pulled the massive door open just enough to let them slip through. They squeezed through the gap like rats escaping a flooding hull, their heavy breathing and the frantic scuffing of their leather boots echoing down the outer corridor until the guards slammed the door shut behind them. Boom! The heavy thud of the iron latch falling into place sealed the great hall once more. The chaotic noise of the fleeing bureaucracy faded into nothingness. Ilazar, Luria's voice sliced cleanly through the sudden quiet. You will remain. Halfway to the door, the chief advisor froze. His right foot was suspended mid-step. The command struck him like a physical blow to the spine. Slowly, agonizingly, Eleazar lowered his foot and turned back to face the long table, the dead body, and the terrifying, faceless woman at the head of it all. Beneath his fine, heavily embroidered robes, Eleazar was entirely consumed by a cold, suffocating dread. He was an old survivor, a master of the political game who had navigated the treacherous waters of Drea's court for decades, but he had never faced a storm like this. His fear was twofold, a jagged blade cutting him from two sides. The first was the primal, immediate terror of execution. He stared at the blue blood dripping onto the floor, knowing perfectly well that his own blood could easily join it within the next 10 seconds. The honor guard, who had performed the execution, was still standing merely 5 paces away, his broadsword still unsheathed and dripping wet. But his second fear was vastly deeper, an existential panic that gnawed at his soul. Eleazar was a traditionalist. He was a creature of the old regime, a staunch loyalist to the methods of King Nizal. Nizal was a butcher, yes, but he was a butcher who followed the ancient, unwritten rules of their society. The late king respected the foundational pillars of the citadel. Luria, however, was actively taking a sledgehammer to those very pillars. Eleazar was watching his entire life's work, the carefully balanced architecture of Drea's governance, being gleefully dismantled by a radical matriarch. He feared that even if he survived the day, the kingdom would inevitably collapse under the sheer, unsustainable weight of her ruthless, tradition-breaking reforms. He forced his shaking legs to carry him back toward the table, stopping a respectful, extremely cautious distance away from the pooling blood. He bowed his head low, hoping his trembling was not visible in the dim light. "It is the perfect time to discuss the duties left behind by my father," Luria said calmly, resting her hands on the armrests of her chair. She sounded completely unaffected by the slaughter that had just occurred, inches from her. The lingering threads of his reign. "Tell me, Eleazar, what is waiting for me?" Eleazar swallowed hard, his throat parched. He focused all his remaining willpower on keeping his voice steady, channeling decades of diplomatic training to mask the terror threatening to choke him. "The ambassadors from Siram, Supreme Matriarch," Eleazar began, his voice raspy but measured. "They were scheduled to arrive and meet with your late father. This was a complex diplomatic process, a summit that had been carefully arranged and organized a long time ago, after months of delicate correspondence." He paused, glancing nervously at the featureless silver mask, trying to gauge a reaction that simply wasn't there. "However," he continued, "we tragically lost your father while these envoys were already en route to our borders. I cannot be entirely certain, but it is highly unlikely that the approaching delegation is aware that the crown has passed. They do not know that you have ascended to the silver throne." From behind the blinding silver plate, Luria's highly sensitive ears picked up the subtle, anxious quiver in the old advisor's chest. She processed the information in a fraction of a second. The rival empire, the ancient enemy, sending their diplomats into the heart of the darkness. A slow, deeply sinister smile curled the corners of her lips, the only part of her face visible beneath the heavy metal visor. "The diplomatic efforts of an enemy race," Luria mused aloud, her voice taking on a dark, intrigued cadence. She did not sound worried, she sounded hungry. "Let us see exactly what the Emperor of Siram has to say to us. He expects to negotiate with the tired, predictable ghost of my father. Instead, he will find a brand new Drea staring back at him. It will startle him. I am entirely certain of that." Eleazar nodded quickly, eager to align himself with her confidence, even as his internal panic continued to rage. "Undoubtedly they will be deeply startled, matriarch. They are walking blindly into a fundamentally changed landscape. Their arrival is imminent, perhaps only a matter of days. As soon as they reach the outer gates of the citadel, I will inform you immediately." Luria tilted her head slightly, as if listening to a distant frequency. "Is there nothing else? Is the arrival of foreign spies the entirety of the burden my father left upon this table?" "I will absolutely keep you informed the moment any new developments arise, my lady," Eleazar assured her rapidly, desperate to prove his continued usefulness. "During the final, chaotic period of your father's decline, as his illness took hold, I was forced to halt many ongoing dialogues and freeze the flow of sensitive reports to prevent administrative collapse. I had to maintain the illusion of control. But now that you are firmly seated upon the throne, I have initiated the reactivation of those processes. I will compile and present to you all the backlogged reports from the period I was forced to pause." "Good," Luria replied, her tone dismissive but satisfied. She drummed her pale fingers lightly against the armrest. "I do not yet know exactly what the Seram ambassador is truly chasing within our walls, but I must admit I am profoundly curious to find out." Eleazar hesitated. His traditionalist instincts flared. Dealing with Seram was never a simple matter of welcoming guests. It was akin to inviting a venomous serpent into the bedchamber. He felt a sudden, dangerous obligation to warn his new ruler, to offer the counsel of his years. "Supreme Matriarch," Eleazar said, lowering his voice into a gravelly, conspiratorial whisper. "You must know, Emperor Ravan of Seram is a deeply contrarian leader. He possesses a highly unorthodox stance on all matters of statecraft." Luria did not interrupt. She sat perfectly still, letting him speak. "Whatever the rest of the realm is doing," Eleazar explained, his anxiety bleeding into his words, "Ravan will actively do the exact opposite. He defies conventional logic purely to keep his enemies off balance. They cannot be trusted under any circumstances. We may need to exercise extreme caution when dealing with his envoys. They carry all manner of trickery, hidden agendas, and political deceit within them." Luria absorbed the warning in total silence. She imagined this Emperor Ravan, a man who prided himself on unpredictability, trying to play his contrarian games against the cold, unyielding machinery she was building. The thought did not intimidate her. It amused her deeply. "When he arrives, Eleazar," Luria finally said, her voice dropping to a chilling, absolute whisper that brokered no further debate, "I will be the one to give him his answer. You are dismissed. Withdraw."